Before I start, Nadja didn't ask us how we would respond to Jason.
Okay.
And if she had asked us, we would have said, Jason, you'll love it when our SCCT applications book comes out. But anyway, as everyone's done so far, I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference for inviting me. But I do have a bone to pick. You heard about the papers we sent in? You just heard about it? They asked us for 15-page papers. And I automatically thought, 15-page paper, they want me to talk for 30 minutes.
No.
Right. And so I contacted Jim last week, and he said, no, 10 or 15 minutes. So you're going to get my Reader's Digest version today. But you can find the paper online. Okay, so to start, as the title indicates, I think I'll comment on two things. And the title's different than the title I was given that you heard about. I'm going to talk about two things, the implications for evidence-based practice that can be gleaned from prior meta-analyses of the career intervention outcome literature. And then I'm going to talk second about the necessary future directions, meta-analytic or otherwise, that I think we need to follow to move us closer to an evidence-based and scientifically informed career practice. The implications that I draw come from three meta-analyses. Two are really old. One is Brown and Ryan Crane, 2000. The other is Whiston, Sexton, and Lasoff in 1998. The third one is by Liu et al. I don't know if you've seen it. It appeared in the Journal of Applied Psychology, 2014, and it looked at critical ingredients of job-finding intervention. So I'm going to use those three. I chose the Brown and Ryan Crane and the Whiston et al. Studies because they focused on somewhat overlapping outcomes that could reflect outcomes associated with interventions for choice-making problems. I also chose them because they were the most recent, and they used identical meta-analytic strategies, including using Hedges G as an effect size estimate. Hedges G typically yields somewhat less biased estimates of effect sizes than other effect size indexes like Cohen's D because it corrects for sampling error and small sample bias. And we're actually would be comparing apples and apples rather than apples and oranges. And I opted to include the Liu et al. Meta-analysis because it focused specifically on outcomes associated with job-finding interventions that I think should be of more interest to SVP members than they appear to be today. The future directions that I suggest as critical to advancing evidence-based practice are just three of many I could have chosen. Two, I think, are somewhat unique, while the third has been offered repeatedly, but I'm going to suggest a somewhat different take on this third issue. I hope other speakers in the plenary session will probably come up with lots of other interesting directions for future primary as well as meta-analytical research. And after all, the yield from meta-analysis is only as good as the primary research that goes into them. So, I have three lessons that we've learned from prior meta-analysis, kind of the current status. I think the yield from meta-analytic literature has been surprisingly meager, but I think there are three important things that we've learned, or at least in terms of career choice outcomes, what we learned up to the year 2000. And here's the first one. Career interventions are modestly more effective than doing nothing in promoting outcomes associated with choice making and job finding. Whiston et al. And Brown Ryan Crane reported Hedges G's of 0.30 and 0.34 respectively, with standard errors of 0.02 and 0.01. The 95% confidence intervals obtained from these two meta-analyses overlap almost completely. and suggests that career interventions for primarily choice-making difficulties are or were by the year 2000, probably not lower than 0.26 and not higher than 0.36, that the average counseled client achieves about a quarter to a third of a standard deviation better outcome than those persons who receive no career counseling. Liu et al. In 2014 found that the odds ratio associated with job finding interventions was 2.67. In other words, the odds of obtaining a job were 2.67 higher for participants in a job finding intervention than those who didn't participate in job finding interventions. Okay. Lesson 2. There are several intervention components that seem to be important for both choice making and job finding interventions. Brown and Ryan Crane found that 5 intervention components were associated with improved effect size, regardless of what was done in the intervention. And I list them there. And if you'll notice, the first letters are in bold. John Holland called me up shortly after this came out and said, this stuff needs an acronym, and I got one for you. It's whimsy. And so whenever I talk about this stuff, my title is always Using Whimsy in Career Counseling. But, so you see the 5 there: written goals, information on the world of work, modeling, support building, individual attention to goals and assessment results, or whimsy. Liu et al. Found that there were 6 intervention components of job finding interventions that seem to contribute significantly to the outcome. Those were teaching, I couldn't come up with an acronym, if you could, teaching job search skills, improving self-presentation, boosting self-efficacy, encouraging proactivity, promoting goal setting, and enlisting support. My final lesson is, I don't know if you noticed, there were 2 common ingredients across job finding and career choice in the career choice intervention, and those were goal setting and support building. And I think whatever else you do, if you work with clients to set goals and build supports, those may be important ingredients of all counseling interventions. They might even be as close as we have at this point to an empirically supported suggestions for career interventions. As an aside, at dinner last night, I learned that Sue was updating the 2000 meta-analysis. And at that time, we only had 6 studies in that meta-analysis that looked at career decision-making self-efficacy beliefs. Now, 32. And Sue found the ingredient that had the largest effect size was career decision-making self-efficacy. And if you go back to those, I would add a third important ingredient, regardless of what you're doing. That's goal setting, support building, and building self-efficacy beliefs. If you're doing career choice counseling, that's career decision-making self-efficacy beliefs. If you're doing job-finding intervention, that's job-finding self-efficacy. So those are the 3 things I think we've learned from the meta-analysis. And I have some suggestions for future research. These don't come from the meta-analyses. These are just things I wanted to talk about. Okay, first, I think we need to identify core outcome constructs that we're interested in. Sue's written in 2001 that we need a core battery of outcome measures in career intervention research, but I think that those efforts would be real premature until we identify the core constructs that are being measured by the plethora of measures we have out there. This is, again, we have an enormous number of measures in our literature, and I think many of them, regardless of what they're called or what their titles are really measuring the same thing. I don't have time to go into why I think that. You can learn more about it if you read the entire paper and some references I have in the entire paper. But for example, previous research, I've shown that Jim Sampson Associates decision-making confusion scale and John Holland's vocational identity scale are really measuring the same things. They're actually measuring redundant constructs. Regardless of what we call this common construct that these two different measures are measuring, I think it's redundant to employ these two scales in an outcome study thinking that they're measuring different things when they're really not. And I have some other data to show how other measures that have different names in our literature are really measuring the same thing. So kind of my bottom line is, before coming up with a battery of measures to evaluate outcome, we have to finally figure out what those measures are commonly measuring, whatever the titles of the measures are. I had a mentor who once told me that measures measure what the items are measuring, not what the author says they're measuring necessarily. So we have to identify core constructs. Second thing we have to do, we need to know whether career interventions actually make a difference in the lives of our clients. It's clear from Brown, Ryan, Crane, and Whiston et al. Meta-analyses, for example, that career interventions are modestly effective at increasing client scores on measures of career maturity, vocational identity, whatever that scale is measuring, career exploration, and more. What is not clear, however, is if clients' lives are improved by gains on these measures. Although the proof of the pudding will come only after follow-up studies that assess clients' life satisfaction, work satisfaction, well-being, to name a few possibilities, I've also written about a more proximal way to address this questions via analyses of clinical significance of outcomes. And again, you can get the reference in the longer paper, and I don't have time to explain it. But it is derived from Neil Jacobson and colleagues' clinical significance methodology that has been used quite clearly in the psychotherapy outcome research. The method basically addresses the question of whether clients become more like non-clients after receiving counseling on the outcome measure used in the study. Thus, for example, do adolescents at risk for dropping out of high school become more like high school graduates on a measure of school engagement after receiving a career intervention versus students in a control condition? Doing the clinical significance research requires normative client and non-client data on most outcome measures. Megan Roche and I provided in a 2016 JCA article some normative data that could be used for addressing clinical significance with several measures: the short form of the career decision-making self-efficacy scale, the career decision-making difficulties questionnaire, ITAMAR's questionnaire, the career thoughts inventory, and the satisfaction with life scale. You can find all these in the longer paper. Okay, here's the last one. We need to conduct outcome research with more diverse samples. This is not new. It's been emphasized by a number of people, too numerous to list here, for years. However, this admonition is usually, unfortunately to me, accompanied by an assumption that interventions developed from current career theories will not work for the poor and marginalized members of our society, because career theories assume that people have a lot of volition and can choose freely. The poor and marginalized obviously have much less volition, and so the thinking goes, current career theories and interventions derived from them won't work. Unfortunately, this assumption has never really been tested, but has become to me so reified that I think it's the closest thing to a scientific law we have in the field today. I would recommend that we actually test this assumption. And to do less might actually be doing a disservice to those who need our our services the most. I have an example of somebody who did that. Dick and Hansen in 2011 tested whether a volition-like variable, perceived control over one's work, moderated the relationship between RIASEC fit and job satisfaction, and found exactly the opposite from what we would expect if our current law or assumption was true, that the relationship between RIASEC fit and job satisfaction was stronger for those with less volition than more volition. The relationship among those with more volition was near zero, suggesting that for those with a lot of volition, fit may not be that important. Thus, current PE fit theories may, if this study is ever replicated, if we ever do any research addressing this assumption, PE fit theories may be less relevant for those with more rather than less volition, and more relevant for those with less volition. If replicated, these results suggest that PE fit interventions may be, again, more beneficial for those with less rather than more volition. Perhaps because the more volitional have more freedom to find better fitting jobs when things don't work out. So I think in the end, we need to let the data speak for themselves. But I think we actually need the data before they can say anything to us. Thank you.